Good evening and welcome to Antiquarians Anonymous. This is Dr. Alan Barton here. This evening in this video I'm going to talk to you about a quite remarkable story. It's a story related to St Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, one of the most popular, most wonderful saints from early medieval Britain. It's not the story of his life, it's not the story of his miracles, but it's the story of his body, of his relics, what happened to them in the course of 800 or 900 years. Who was St Cuthbert of Lindisfarne? St Cuthbert was an extraordinary monk and bishop who lived in the middle of the 7th century. Born in 634 near Melrose in modern-day Scotland, then the Kingdom of Northumbria, at the age of 11 Cuthbert had an extraordinary vision. He woke in the middle of the night to see a vision of St Aidan's soul being lifted to heaven. It was the night that St Aidan died. St Aidan himself was a visionary man. He had founded on Holy Island the great monastery and cathedral of Lindisfarne, which was the seat of the Bishop of Northumbria at the time. At that moment, Cuthbert decided that he too would follow in Aidan's footsteps and become a monk. And that's precisely what he did. He went along to his local abbey at Melrose and became a monk. Very quickly his talent was recognised, and before he was 30 he was prior of the monastery. Then at the age of 31 he was elected as prior of Lindisfarne itself. For the next 10 years he administered the monastery of Lindisfarne well, and he was a good administrator, but within himself there was an inner urge, an itch to do something else. And after 10 years, then in his early 40s, he decided to become a hermit. Got in a boat, sailed 7 miles across the sea to a little island called Farne, and built with his own hands a hermitage there. And he would spend most of the rest of his life in that hermitage, living a life of asceticism. Most of what we know about Cuthbert's life we get from Bede's life of him. Venerable Bede was a near contemporary. He was 10 years old when Cuthbert died, and certainly knew people who knew Cuthbert. One of the ascetic feats that Cuthbert regularly attempted was to stand in the sea all night praying. Often when he went back to dry land in the morning, by tradition, otters would come and dry his feet. Unfortunately for Cuthbert, this ascetic life would not last very long. Without his knowledge, he was elected the new Bishop of Lindisfarne. He took considerable persuasion to accept the role. So much persuasion that he refused on a number of occasions, and it actually took the King of Northumbria and a group of assembled bishops and monastics to get in a boat and go to Farne to persuade him to become Lindisfarne's bishop. With such pressure, he reluctantly agreed, and he was consecrated bishop by Theodore of Canterbury in 685. And he was a very good bishop, like he'd been a very good prior. He spent the next couple of years, for 18 months, walking around his new diocese, meeting people and confirming people. But always in the back of his mind was that continuing itch to get back to the ascetic life. And so, after 18 months, that's precisely what he did. He remained as Bishop of Lindisfarne, but he got in his boat, he went back to Farne and spent the rest of his life in his little hermitage on the island. He died within about a year of returning to his home. Now, he had intended that when he died, he would be buried there in his hermitage, but the monks of Lindisfarne had other ideas, and they kept coming to the island and bothering about it. In the end, he agreed that when he died they could take his body back to Lindisfarne and bury it in the priory church. Cuthbert died in 687 in his early 50s, and his body was taken back to the priory church in Lindisfarne and buried in a new stone tomb that they had constructed for him. Unsurprisingly, for someone whose feats of asceticism and holiness were well known in his lifetime, very quickly people started to come to his tomb and miracles started to occur there. It's at this point that we come to the main subject matter of this video, which is the state of St Cuthbert's remains. 11 years after Cuthbert's death, in 698, according to Bede and also an anonymous prose life of St Cuthbert, the monks of Lindisfarne open his coffin. They did this in order to take his bones from the tomb as relics. But what they found when they opened the tomb on the 20th of April was that Cuthbert's body was still intact. His body was entire, and Bede writes, as if he was still alive, and his joints were still flexible, as if he were not dead but sleeping, and his clothes were undecayed and seemed to retain their original freshness and colour. And Bede says that when the brethren saw this, they were so astonished that they could scarcely speak or look on the miracle that lay before them. So they wrapped Cuthbert's body up in 2 linen shrouds, and then they placed him in a new timber coffin that they'd prepared, and then they placed the timber coffin on top of his original tomb. And there it lay for around the next 200 years. The monastery at Lindisfarne carried on its business until the beginning of the 9th century, when it became increasingly difficult to continue a monastic life there. What had changed? Well, the political landscape had changed. The Vikings in the 9th century were increasingly raiding along the coast, and there were occasions when the monastery at Lindisfarne itself had been invaded by Viking raiders. By 875, it was very clear that staying at Lindisfarne was untenable, so the community decided to move. Before they did, they packed all their precious belongings, all the relics that they had in their church, all the valuable books they had, into the coffin of St Cuthbert, and they carried the relics of the saint with all these things within it off to the mainland. For the next 7 years they were homeless. They wandered from place to place with the coffin of Cuthbert. They went up to Melrose, where Cuthbert had been prior in his earlier years, eventually coming slightly further south to Chester Street, where they settled for the next 100. Then, at the end of the 10th century, the monks began to think that things were getting difficult again, so they decided to uproot with the coffin of Cuthbert and head towards Ripon in Yorkshire. They didn't get that far. Now, there is a story that they were heading south and they saw 2 milkmaids. These 2 milkmaids were looking for a dun-coloured cow. And thinking that the milkmaids clearly knew the route south, they followed them to discover that they were at a dead end. They were in a peninsula created by the River Wear. Despair, they put the coffin of Cuthbert down, and when they tried to pick it up again, it was too heavy to do so. Cuthbert had decided where he was going to be. That location is the site of modern day Durham Cathedral, which is why to this day Cuthbert's relics can still be found in Durham Cathedral. He effectively founded it. It seems that Cuthbert's coffin remained right next to the high altar in the monastic choir of an increasingly expanding Anglo-Saxon church. The number of pilgrims who were visiting his shrine must have become increasingly irritating and annoying for the monks who were trying to continue their monastic rule of prayer. So the beginning of the 12th century was the time when the cathedral is being rebuilt. They decide to move Cuthbert's remains from their resting place by the altar to a new shrine behind it. In preparation for that work in 1104, the monks decide to open the 10th century tomb of Cuthbert and examine his relics. And they find that Cuthbert is immured like a Russian doll, in effect. There's an outer stone tomb, and when they take that structure away, that reveals a wooden coffin covered in leather and with iron studs in it. And when they remove that outer coffin, wooden coffin of leather and iron, they discover that there is an inner coffin of timber that is wrapped around with layers of linen cloth. At this point, the monks are clearly very nervous about what they're doing. They'd heard all the stories about Cuthbert's incorruption, but they didn't really know what they were going to find. The coffin hadn't been opened in living memory, but there must have been older members of their community that remember stories about the coffin being opened in the 11th century. Reginald of Dohem, who is the source for this story of the reopening in 1104, tells us that in the middle of the 11th century, a man called Alfred, son of Westow, who was the keeper of the shrine of St Cuthbert, used to open the shrine frequently and used to comb the saint's hair and trim his fingernails. And we also know that he deposited within the inner coffin of Cuthbert relics from elsewhere, including the bones of the Venerable Bede. Naughty Alfred, son of Westow, went to Jarrow and in the middle of the night on one occasion and stole the relics of Bede, bringing them back to Durham and depositing them in Cuthbert's coffin. So the monks, by this point probably being rather nervous wrecks, take the coffin of Cuthbert and they place it in the middle of the choir and they take the lid off. And what they see is quite extraordinary. There is the body of Cuthbert, and he's propped up on his right side because the rest of the coffin is filled with other things, including a beautiful book of the Gospels, which I'll talk about in another video, and relics, bags of relics and miscellaneous bones. Cuthbert is cradling in his arms the head of Saint King Oswald, and at his feet, in 2 linen bags, are other relics of the saints, including those of the Venerable Bede. They remove all the relics, which they go and inter elsewhere, and then they take out the body of Cuthbert and they lay it down on a carpet. And as they do so, they realise not only is he incorrupt, his body hasn't decayed, but his body is still flexible. So flexible that then when they take him out of the coffin, with monks supporting his shoulders and lifting from that end, and some lifting by his feet, as they take him out, Cuthbert bends in the middle, and they have to get another monk to come underneath and support his waist. Cuthbert's body smells sweet. From the coffin that he had been interred in for so long came a beautiful perfume smell. Cuthbert's relics had the odour of sanctity. Think of medieval people as taking all these things on face value. But when the monks told Bishop Flambard, the Bishop of Durham, about this, he didn't believe it. Medieval people were often sceptical about these sorts of things. But he came into the cathedral, and the monks got the remains of Cuthbert out of his coffin again and laid them again on the choir floor. That night, Bishop Flambard came and saw for himself. The body of Cuthbert was dressed in vestments, it was wrapped up and placed in the original 2 coffins back into the Russian doll, and then it was placed behind the high altar on a raised plinth and covered with a ferret tree to protect it, which, as the Middle Ages went on, became increasingly elaborate. wasn't the end of the scepticism and the controversy. On the very day of the translation of the relics, which was the 29th of August 1104, a number of the visiting abbots who were in attendance accused the monks of deception. So the Russian doll was dismantled again. The ferretry was taken off, the outer coffin, and then the inner coffin opened, and the body of Cuthbert was laid once again on the carpet in the choir. And a man called Ralph de Sees, who would go on to be Archbishop of Canterbury, conducted an inspection of the body. So Ralph moved Cuthbert's head around, he tugged at his ears, he raised him up into a seated position to see how flexible the body was in the centre. He examined the body all over, saying that the nerves and the bones were solid and that the whole of the body was covered in soft flesh. If all this is to believe, Cuthbert's body after 400 years was as entire as the day he died. For the next 400 years, they leave Cuthbert alone in his coffin. The shrine he is in becomes increasingly elaborated. The Russian doll. Pilgrims come from all over England to visit his shrine, both kings and commoners. Then, all of a sudden, it comes to an end. In the 1530s, King Henry VIII declares himself to be head of the Church of England, and Catholic influence upon England is gone forever. Under the influence of increasingly Protestant advisors, the king begins an attack on the cult of the saints. Henry VIII sends commissioners out across the country to confiscate all the great wealth from the shrines of the saints and to destroy their relics. Henry sends to Durham 3 commissioners to destroy the shrine of St Cuthbert. A crafty lawyer called Dr. Lee, accompanied by a Dr. Henley and a Master Blytheman, they strip the shrine of all its gold, its silver, its plate, its gems, and its votive offerings. Then they turn their attention to the relics of Cuthbert himself in its Russian doll. Now, our account of what happens next we have from an extraordinary document, an anonymous document that is still within the Cathedral Library in Durham, called the Rights of Dohem, probably written by a younger member of the monastic community and written some time after the event. It's almost certainly a reliable account of what happened in 1539, as the Rights of Dohem are reliable in so many other respects, with regard to the furnishings and the ritual of the priory before the dissolution of the monastery. Getting into the relics is easier said than done, because as you remember, Cuthbert is in various layers of coffin, outer ferretry, and then a stout chest within, and then within that the linen-wrapped original coffin created in 698. So they employ a goldsmith to crack the whole thing open. After working away with a hammer and chisel, eventually the goldsmith gets in and finds himself face to face with St Cuthbert. He and the commissioners get rather more than they bargained for. St Cuthbert's body is still incorrupt and is so well preserved that you can still see beard growth on his chin, 2 weeks growth. The commissioners, who stood beside the shrine on the ground, shout up to the goldsmith to throw down the bones of Cuthbert, but he says he can't. Dr. Lee climbs up onto the top of the shrine and looks for himself and sees indeed that Cuthbert is entire. Dr. Henley's down on the ground, shouts to Lee to throw down the bones, and he said, "No, I can't. He's here. He's whole. Come and see for yourself." So Dr. Henley clambers up too, and he sees for himself that Cuthbert is incorrupt. Well, what do? Well, it seems to me that they panic. They don't know what to do. It's one thing destroying the bones of a saint, throwing them on a fire or chucking them in a river. It is a quite different thing disposing of a complete body. These commissioners aren't stupid men. You know, Dr. Lee is a well-respected lawyer and diplomat. He wouldn't have wanted to create a riot. Disposing of Cuthbert's incorrupt remains in front of a populace of people who still were devoted to his memory would have been complete and utter folly. It would have been a recipe for disaster. They just do nothing. They pass the buck. They say to the monks that they are to put Cuthbert's remains somewhere secure, and they put him in the vestry, and that they are to await the pleasure of the king, instructions from the king as to what to do next. Those instructions never come. So what do we make of this story about the incorruption, the completeness of the relics of St Cuthbert? Do we believe them? The story is pretty consistent and is attested by multiple sources. With respect to the exhumation in 698, this is attested by the Venerable Bede, who was alive at the time. The accounts of the exhumation in 1104 are full of comments about the scepticism of other people and very, very graphic descriptions of how the corpse, the relics of St Cuthbert were handled. As for the account in the Rights of Dohem in 1539, do we believe these? Well, there are no accounts to the contrary that describe the destruction of Cuthbert's relics entirely. So yes, I personally think that we can probably trust these accounts, and that the relics of St Cuthbert, a wonderful ascetic saint, were intact for at least 900 years from his death in 687 until 1539. The story, of course, doesn't end there. We left things in 1539 awaiting the king's pleasure. The king never gave any instructions as to what to do with Cuthbert's body. The story goes that his body was taken and buried in a new tomb that was constructed underneath the site of his medieval shrine. An alternative story that the body of Cuthbert was swapped with remains of that of an anonymous monk, and that the remains of the anonymous monk were buried in the grave under the medieval shrine, and that the remains of St Cuthbert are in fact buried elsewhere. In 1827, the Cathedral Library, Dr. James Raine, opened the grave on the shrine site and found the coffin of Cuthbert within. Or should I say coffins? There were 3 coffins, the original Russian doll. Within the Russian doll there were the remains of a bishop, a second male skull, and a whole host of disarticulated bones. The skull of the man is almost certainly that of St Oswald. Who the disarticulated bones are, we have no idea. Presumably the collected relics from the medieval priory. The remains of the bishop were dressed in episcopal vestments, and there were a whole series of different grave goods in there that identified this as St Cuthbert. And I'm going to talk about those grave goods in another video. Unfortunately, the remains, if they were of Cuthbert, which they almost certainly are, were not any longer incorrupt. When he'd finished, Dr. Raine returned the remains to the grave and he sealed it up, having removed some of the vestments and textiles that he found and the grave goods. The grave was opened again in 1899 for a second examination, and the opportunity was taken to remove the bones of Cuthbert and to have a good look at them. And some evidence appeared to suggest that these remains had at some point either been incorrupt or mummified in some sort of way. There were bits of dried and desiccated skin and flesh still attached to some of the bones, and in the eye socket of the skull there was what appeared to be a shrunken and shriveled eyeball, complete with eyelid and eyelashes. So what are we to make of the story of the incorruption of St Cuthbert, which seems to have been absolutely genuine? What to make of the whole concept of the incorruption of saintly remains? Because St Cuthbert is not an isolated example. Right across the Christian world there are examples of incorrupt saints, both ancient and modern. If you go to the island of Corfu, you can go and see the relics of St Spiridon, who lived at the beginning of the 4th century. He was present at the First Ecumenical Council in Nicaea. His relics, mummified, are still preserved. Then there are the relics of the Russian saint St Alexander of Sphere, who are extraordinarily well preserved, even 500 years after his death. His skin and his flesh are not even discoloured. In events that almost mirror the events of 1539 in Durham, when the Bolsheviks come face to face with St Alexander's spheres, incorrupt remains, they likewise do not know what to do. They do not destroy them, but their response is to simply put them in a museum of religion and hide him out of the way so he can't influence the faithful. His remains are only given back to the Orthodox Church again in 1998. There are modern examples of this phenomena too. Take, for example, St John Maximovich, St John of Shanghai and San Francisco, a modern saint who died in the 1960s, the late 1960s, when his coffin was opened in the 1990s, when he was glorified as an Orthodox saint. They too were darkened but found to be intact. His remains are still intact to this day, enshrined within the Orthodox Cathedral in San Francisco. The scientific mind might consider this phenomenon to be the consequence of certain atmospheric conditions preserving the body of the deceased. With St Cuthbert, you might argue that's what's happened. For a lot of his history, for at least 400 years, his relics were kept well wrapped within the confines of that Russian doll, those two outer coffins and the inner one covered in linen cloths. Certainly that treatment would have kept air away from the remains of Cuthbert and could potentially have mummified the body. However, for the 100 years after 875, they were much more vulnerable. Travelling around from place to place, there can scarcely have been a time when the remains of Cuthbert were not exposed to changes of temperature and humidity. We will never know if there's a natural explanation to this or a miraculous one. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. St Cuthbert is one of only a handful of saints whose relics are still today where they were in the Middle Ages. They escaped destruction during the English Reformation. If you go into Durham Cathedral today where his relics lie, you go behind the high altar into the Chapel of the Nine Altars, under a great big stone slab with the name Cuthbertus upon it, his remains still rest. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. This is going to be the first in a series of videos I'm going to make about St Cuthbert. And the next one in the series is going to be about the opening of his grave in 1827 by Dr. James Raine, the cathedral librarian. And during the opening, Raine, as well as the relics of St Cuthbert, Raine found an extraordinary collection of artefacts from anglo-saxon England, including metalwork and woodwork and textiles. And that's going to be a really interesting exploration. Well, I'm also going to talk in that video about some of the other objects that we know about that were put into Cuthbert's coffin when the monks fled from Lindisfarne in 875. But some of those objects still survive. So stay tuned for that. If you've liked what you've seen in this video this evening, press the subscribe button below and by the magic of YouTube, you'll be told when there is a next edition of Antiquarians Anonymous. Thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.